and you're listening to Officer Down. It's a true crime podcast where the victim is law enforcement. So I've been wanting to do this for quite a while. I thought of doing this as a game in the beginning, and then I thought, I think I would like to do this as a podcast. It's an interesting topic to me, and we really take it for granted how many people in law enforcement end up being victims of homicide, whether it's a police shootout or a spouse who looking for insurance payout. So this series will look at different tragedies involving the police as victims. So for the inaugural edition, I decided to do the Mayerthorpe tragedy of 2005. So if you're not familiar with that, it was four RCMP agents, four Mounties. They came onto a call which had catastrophic consequences and left its mark in more than one way. So let's begin. So in March 2005, quiet Alberta town of Mayerthorpe would forever be changed by events so shocking, so violent, that the scars remained etched in the hearts of every resident. Before dawn broke, four RCMP officers, each with a life, a family, and a story, were lost in a single ambush, marking the deadliest day for Canadian law enforcement in nearly half a century. This is their story, and this is Mayerthorpe's reckoning. The fallen four were Constable Anthony Gordon. He was 28 years old, raised in Red Deer with dreams of serving as a Mountie since age 6. Anthony was known for his quiet integrity, love of athletics, and devotion to his wife, Kit, and their young son. He was stationed in Whitecourt, handling highway patrols and general policing. His second child was born after his death, named in his honor. Constable Leo Johnston was 32 years old. The adventurous and kind-hearted marksman from Lac La Biche, Leo grew up with his identical twin, joined the RCMP in 2001, and forged deep ties with the local First Nations. He survived a motorcycle crash years earlier, only to fall on duty less than 4 months after marrying his wife, Kelly. Then there was Constable Brock Myrle, 29 years old. Mayerthorpe's newest officer, valedictorian of his RCMP training class, skilled martial artist, and passionate musician. He was engaged to be married and had spent nearly a decade in security before joining the force. His service just lasted 17 days. And then there was Constable Peter Sheeman, 25 years old. Sociologist, musician, and an exceptional marksman, Peter began RCMP work in Mayerthorpe, balancing policing with a love of cars and outdoor pursuits. He was deeply connected to his family and church. His father would later lead calls for answers about the tragedy. So let's talk a little bit about Mayerthorpe. It's a town of about almost not quite 1,400 people, 1,378, with a modest annual growth. Mayerthorpe lies northwest of Edmonton at a crossroads that blends agriculture, oil and gas, and transport. It's a pastoral seat with outsized responsibility. Its RCMP detachment polices a huge rural swath, including First Nations communities and surrounding hamlets. Economic stability masks tougher truths: aging population, youth migration, and persistent staffing challenges at the detachment, where only 7 of 10 positions are filled. Crime rates run high for Alberta, especially assaults and threats, though property crimes are declining. In 2025, violent crimes and property crime far exceeded the provincial and national averages, fueled by rural isolation and fluctuating resource employment. So this was not a safe area, and it was under-policed. So we're seeing here already hints of a disaster lurking. So let's introduce the killer here, James Roscoe. James Roscoe was a longtime local troublemaker, well known to law enforcement in Mayerthorpe and the surrounding rural communities. So he had a reputation. He had a criminal history that spanned drug offenses, property crimes, and harassment charges. Deeply distrustful and prone to violence, Roscoe was embittered by repeated confrontations with police. His paranoia and criminal behavior had escalated over the years, and he maintained an isolated, heavily guarded property with Rottweilers and surveillance equipment. On the day of the tragedy, his grow-up and stolen goods operation were discovered, prompting his desperate, violent response. But he didn't do this alone. He had 2 confederates with him. The first was Sean Hennessy, and the second was Dennis Cheeseman, and they were local residents with complicated ties to Roscoe. Hennessy, who was related to Roscoe through marriage, lived in fear of him, yet became drawn into the incident. He and Cheeseman, his brother-in-law, aided Roscoe on the night before the murders. They provided Roscoe with a gun, ammunition, gloves, and a ride to his mother's adjacent property, knowing full well he intended violence against the police. So all the elements of an implosion were right there. Enablers, an angry man, understaffing, and an isolated area. So how did the situation escalate? On March 2nd, 2005, bailiffs arrived at a local property on routine civil enforcement, a repossession. The encounter with James Roscoe, a figure infamous in Mayerthorpe, quickly spiraled. Officers discovered a marijuana grow-op and evidence of criminal activity, and by nightfall, Mayerthorpe, RCMP, and backup from White Court were pressed into overnight guard duty. In the early hours of March 3rd, Roscoe, enabled by his acquaintances, returned, armed and intent. Within minutes, 4 officers were ambushed inside a Quonset hut, killed almost instantly. The killer's suicide ended the standoff, but began decades of grief, inquiry, and community rebuilding. Their names, Gordon, Johnson, Myrol, Shyman, became symbols of sacrifice, and Mayerthorpe, Alberta, transformed overnight from a dot on a map to the epicenter of a national tragedy. So let's go into the timeline between March 2nd and 2005. So the setup happened March 2nd. At 3:30 p.m., bailiffs arrived at James Roscoe's property to repossess his Ford pickup. Roscoe releases his dogs on them, then flees into his truck swearing. 4 minutes later, Roscoe begins a series of phone calls, contacting Sean Hennessy, his aunt, and searching for his mother while carrying a pistol. He arrives at Hennessy's home. By 5:30 p.m., Mayerthorpe RCMP arrive on Roscoe's property and uncover a marijuana grow-op operation and stolen vehicle parts inside the Quonset hut. Officers from Mayerthorpe and White Court are tasked with guarding the property overnight. By 7:30 p.m., Roscoe speaks with his mother by phone, states he has made a will, and asks her to pray for him. He drives to his aunt's house accompanied by Hennessy and Dennis Cheeseman. By 7:55 p.m., a search warrant is issued. RCMP find 280 marijuana plants valued at anywhere between $66,000 and $1,000, ammunition, police documents with personal cell phone numbers, and other disturbing evidence. So the police were always a target. By 11:30 p.m. that night, RCMP's Green Team, Special Marijuana Investigation Unit, arrives. Late evening, Constables Anthony Gordon and Leo Johnstone are assigned to guard the scene overnight, both equipped with loaded weapons in their vehicles. And then we come to March 3rd. So 1:30 to 3 a.m., Hennessy and Cheeseman drop Roscoe off at his mother's adjacent property. They provide him with gloves, a pillowcase, water, ammunition, and a Winchester rifle. Both would later admit knowing Roscoe planned to kill RCMP officers. At 4 a.m., the Green Team departs, leaving Gordon and Johnson to guard the site. By 7 a.m., Constables Peter Shyman and Brock Myrol arrive. Myrol brings sedation drugs for the guard dogs. Between 9:57 and 10 a.m., Roscoe ambushes all 4 officers inside the Quonset hut, firing 19 shots in approximately 3 minutes. All 4 officers are killed almost instantly. Johnson manages a single return shot before his rifled James. At 10 a.m., Corporal Stephen Vigor, stationed outside, hears the gunfire and sees Roscoe exiting with 3 firearms, a fully automatic rifle, a handgun, and another long gun. Vigor exchanges shots and wounds Roscoe. At 10:01 a.m., Roscoe re-enters the Quonset hut and commits suicide with a gunshot to the chest. By early afternoon, the emergency response team enters the hut and discovers 5 bodies, the 4 officers and Roscoe. The tragedy marks the deadliest single day for the RCMP in half-century. So the Mayerthorpe investigation began immediately after the tragedy and would become one of the most complex police cases in Canadian history, examining not just the mass killing itself, but the people and systems surrounding. So for the investigation, there was a lot of crime scene evidence. So the RCMP's Green Team, specializing in dismantling marijuana operations, was the first to document and sweep the crime scene and the Quonset hut, finding hundreds of plants, stolen vehicle parts, loaded firearms, and disturbing documents with personal data about local police officers. Ballistics matched 19 shots fired by James Roscoe's fully automatic rifle, which killed the officers nearly instantly. Other weapons, including a handgun and a Winchester rifle supplied by Hennessy and Cheeseman, were also recovered. The emergency response team members found all 5 bodies inside the Quonset hut. Roscoe's among those of the 4 Mounties. Roscoe was identified immediately as the perpetrator, but focus quickly shifted to his accomplices Sean Hennessy and Dennis Cheeseman, who dropped Roscoe off at the farm, provided weapons and supplies, and later confessed to knowing his intent to kill RCMP officers, and they did nothing. The police pieced together Roscoe's movements from cell phone records, surveillance, and interviews with relatives and local contacts. Investigators traced every link in the supply chain for the weapons, confirming Hennessy and Cheeseman's role in the supplying of the Winchester rifle and ammunition used by Roscoe. The case was examined in Parliament and through multiple fatality inquiries, which questioned security at rural detachments, staffing shortages, communication breakdowns, and the vulnerability of officers during rural enforcement actions. Family members, including the slain officers' parents, pressed for answers on RCMP procedures, rural backup protocols, and why Roscoe was not treated as a greater threat given his criminal history. Hennessy and Cheeseman were eventually convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison for their roles in enabling Roscoe. Their confessions clarified timeline gaps and confirmed intent. The tragedy led to sweeping reforms in RCMP procedures, including new protocols for guiding crime scenes in remote areas, increased support for rural detachments and improved backup, renewed training for officers' risk assessment during property seizures and drug busts, and nationwide officer safety reviews and mental health initiatives. The aftermath of the Mayerthorpe tragedy deeply affected the local community, the RCMP, and the country, prompting emotional responses, commemoration, and a wide-ranging reforms in rural policing and officer safety. Mayerthorpe became a symbol of loss, but also tried to reinvent itself as a symbol of resilience, with decades-long commitments to commemorative and rebuilding programs that aimed to restore trust between residents and law enforcement. Vigils, memorials, and ceremonies have marked each anniversary of the tragedy, with statues and scholarship funds created in the 4 officers' names. Family and friends continue to publicly honor the fallen, and the town itself maintains a sense of collective mourning and pride for the sacrifice made by Gordon, Johnson, Myrtle, and Shyman. Except that doesn't bring them back. And this could have been stopped. The trauma sparked increased community vigilance, with local leadership and RCMP emphasizing crime prevention and mental health outreach, shaped by the lessons learned after 2005. Although I don't see how a lot of this would have actually stopped. Roscoe's intent to kill. He had accomplices who enabled him, and you had an RCMP that was short-staffed, no matter how you look at it. The tragedy led to parliamentary and public inquiries, scrutinizing the events and RCMP protocols. Key issues addressed included backup procedures for rural crime scenes, risk assessment for major seizures, and support for small detachments facing disproportionately high caseloads. Significant reforms were instituted across Canada, new protocols for scene security and officer support during lengthy investigations and guard duties, improved communications and officer tracking systems, especially in isolated regions, crisis intervention training and mental health kits for officers, inspired by the stress and trauma endured by Mayerthorpe's aftermath. The Mayerthorpe massacre also influenced broader debates on rural crime, policing resources, and safety for officers posted to remote areas, becoming a national touchstone for change. Mayerthorpe's crime rates remain above average, however, not just Alberta, but for Canada. There are community policing efforts and education initiatives, which has increased in response to the tragedy, aiming to strengthen emergency preparedness and mutual understanding between police and residents. Yet this happened 20 years ago, and they're still struggling. Families of the fallen continue to be involved in advocacy, attending inquiries, speaking at commemorative events, and demanding accountability and improvement from the RCMP and government. So the story of Mayerthorpe 4 endures, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a call for reform, remembrance, and respect for those who serve in communities nationwide. So this was a tragedy that very few people can understand. You have people who have forgotten or have never even heard of this tragedy. 4 people lost their lives because there just wasn't an allocation of resources that they needed at the time. They knew Roscoe was trouble. He had a lengthy criminal record. He had obviously inside information, as he had personal information about police officers in the region. So there were a lot of people who helped him along the way. This wasn't in a vacuum. He had it in his mind that he was going to kill RCMP officers, and that's a given. How this changed policing was profound, and yet it can happen again at any given moment. So this is Alexandra Kitty. I hope you enjoyed the first episode. Next week, we're dealing with another case. It's a historical one. So if you like what you hear, subscribe, comment, share, and like, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye for now.